There is a tiny option that used to exist on every single Windows computer, a button so small most people never even noticed it, and Microsoft has spent the last 4 years quietly, methodically hunting it down and killing it for good. It is not a flashy new AI feature. It is not some complicated security overhaul. It is simply the ability to set up your own personal computer without handing over your email address, your identity, and a permanent connection to Microsoft's cloud. And here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. Even after years of backlash, even after Reddit threads exploding with hundreds of angry comments, even after tech journalists calling this out again and again, almost nobody is actually switching back. They are staying angry, staying stuck, and staying on Windows anyway. Let's actually unpack why this keeps happening and why it matters far more than a simple setup screen would suggest. When Windows 11 first launched back in 2021, the option to create a local account, meaning a login that lives entirely on your own machine with no email address, no cloud sync, and no Microsoft account attached, was still technically present. It was tucked away, a little hidden but reachable if you knew where to click. Then came the 22H2 update in 2022, and Microsoft made its first real move. The Home Edition of Windows 11, the version installed on the vast majority of consumer laptops and desktops around the world, had that local account option removed entirely during the initial setup process. From that point forward, if you bought a new Windows 11 home computer, you were required to connect to the internet and sign in with a Microsoft account before you could use your own machine at all. Naturally, the tech community did what tech communities always do when a company removes something people actually want. They found workarounds. The most famous one involved pressing Shift and F10 during setup to open a hidden command prompt, then typing a specific command called do \bipsnro, which would restart the setup process and reveal a hidden option. To continue without internet access, eventually leading to a proper local account creation screen. Another method involved a direct command called ms.ca:\locally, which opened the local account screen immediately, no restart required. There was even a clever, almost silly trick where people would simply type in a deliberately fake or blocked email address, something like no@thankyou.com, which would cause the sign-in process to fail and automatically drop them into a local account setup screen instead. For years, this cat and mouse game played out exactly the way you would expect. Microsoft would ship an update, close off one specific loophole, and within days, sometimes hours, enthusiast communities on Reddit and specialized Windows forums would document a brand new workaround to replace it. But starting in 2025, the pace and intensity of Microsoft's crackdown noticeably increased. The fake email trick was fully blocked in the 24H2 update. Then, in an insider preview build released in October, Microsoft went considerably further, announcing the removal of the entire \bipsnro script itself, the actual file that made the most popular workaround function in the first place. Windows Insider Program. Lida Mandelangovsky explained the reasoning behind the change directly, stating that these mechanisms were being removed specifically because they allowed people to skip what she called critical setup screens, potentially leaving a device that was not fully configured for proper use. That explanation on its own might sound reasonable enough, but the pattern that followed suggests something more deliberate than simple technical housekeeping. In April of 2026, Microsoft closed off another major workaround, disabling the ms.ca:\locally command that had served as a reliable backup method for years. Then, in the June 2026 Patch Tuesday update, the crackdown intensified even further. According to multiple independent reports and community testing, the \bipsnro command stopped functioning reliably on systems that had ever connected to a network during the setup process, even briefly. The only way it continued working consistently was if a computer had never touched the internet at all during its initial out-of-box experience, meaning users now had to physically disconnect their Wi-Fi or unplug their Ethernet cable before even beginning installation, just to preserve their chance at creating a local account. Think about how strange that actually is for a moment, to exercise what used to be a completely normal, unremarkable choice about how you set up your own personal computer. You now have to deliberately sabotage your own internet connection first, like some kind of elaborate digital ritual, just to keep an option that existed without any friction whatsoever only a few years earlier. If you are finding this kind of deep dive into how tech companies quietly reshape user choice genuinely useful, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we track exactly these kinds of slow, creeping changes every single week. The backlash to all of this has been loud, consistent, and remarkably widespread across the entire Windows user base. Reddit threads discussing this exact topic have regularly attracted hundreds of comments, with users accusing Microsoft of what many describe as dark pattern design, a term used to describe interface choices deliberately built to manipulate or restrict user behavior rather than genuinely serve their needs. One particularly telling comment, upvoted heavily in a thread discussing the June update, described how a user who had successfully used the bipasnro command found their local account privileges reset and locked after installing the latest cumulative update, essentially undoing a setup choice they had deliberately and successfully made just weeks earlier. The concerns raised go well beyond simple annoyance, too. Commenters on major tech news sites have pointed out specific, practical scenarios where a mandatory online account genuinely does not make sense. Small municipal governments running kiosk computers in public buildings, libraries setting up public access terminals, industrial control systems, and operational technology. Environments that are deliberately kept air-gapped from the internet for security reasons, sometimes running in facilities as security-conscious as government agencies. Organizations preparing to refresh dozens of workstations that currently run older, still supported versions of Windows, specifically because those machines need to remain isolated from any network connection whatsoever. For all of these genuinely legitimate use cases, forcing an internet connection and a cloud-linked account during setup is not simply inconvenient. It can be a fundamental mismatch with how the computer is actually meant to be used. So why is Microsoft pushing so hard in this particular direction, even in the face of consistent, vocal pushback from a meaningful portion of its user base? The official explanation centers on ensuring devices are, in Microsoft's own words, fully configured for use, implying that skipping the online account setup somehow leaves the computer in an incomplete or improperly prepared state. But there is a more practical and arguably more revealing technical reason underneath that official framing. When a Windows device is linked to a Microsoft account, the BitLocker encryption recovery key gets automatically backed up to that account's cloud storage. This genuinely does provide a real safety net for average consumers who might otherwise lose access to their own encrypted files permanently if something goes wrong with their hardware or a major system update. But that same account linkage does something else too, something less frequently discussed openly. It permanently ties a computer's unique hardware identifier, known as the endorsement key, to a specific Microsoft account. Critics of this system argue that this connection allows security operations on the device to be routed increasingly through Microsoft's own cloud infrastructure, using a process called remote attestation to continuously verify exactly what hardware and software configuration a machine is running. Some more skeptical voices in the security community have gone further, suggesting this kind of continuous verification could theoretically be used to make it more difficult for a device to run alternative operating systems like Linux down the road, though Microsoft has not officially confirmed any such intention. And that particular claim remains speculative rather than confirmed fact. Whatever the precise mixture of motivations actually driving this decision, whether it is primarily about genuine consumer protection, deeper cloud integration, tighter security controls, or simply nudging more people toward Microsoft's broader ecosystem of services, the practical result for everyday users has been the same. Choice has been narrowed, workarounds have been closed one by one, and the community response has been sustained anger rather than acceptance. It is a pattern that plays out repeatedly across the entire technology industry, not just at Microsoft, wherever a platform holder recognizes that the cost of frustrating a portion of its audience is lower than the benefit gained from tighter control over how that audience interacts with its products. There is one detail in all of this that captures just how absurd the current cat and mouse dynamic has become. A popular, entirely legitimate open source tool called Rufus, widely used for creating bootable USB installation drives, has built-in specific options that let users strip out the Microsoft account requirement, along with certain hardware checks like TPM 2.0 and Secure Boot directly from the Windows 11 installation image itself before it ever touches a physical machine. Pete Batard, the developer behind Rufus, confirmed in a tweet posted on June 18th of 2026 that the latest beta version of his tool had already been updated specifically to work around Microsoft's newest June update restrictions. But even Batard himself, the person actively building these workarounds, acknowledged the obvious reality of the situation, warning that this particular game cannot realistically continue forever. At some point, the underlying mechanism these tools rely on will likely be closed off entirely, and the entire workaround ecosystem built around it will simply stop functioning. It is worth noting that this crackdown has not affected every single version of Windows equally, which reveals something interesting about who Microsoft considers worth accommodating and who it does not. Windows 11 Pro, Enterprise, and Education editions still retain a built-in option, accessible through a setup path labeled Setup for Work or School, that allows a local account to be created without triggering any of the online account requirements at all. This option has never been removed, and it does not require any registry edits, command prompt tricks, or third-party tools whatsoever. The catch, of course, is that this legitimate path simply does not exist on Windows 11 Home, the edition installed on the overwhelming majority of consumer laptops and desktops sold to everyday people, in other words, the very users most likely to be uncomfortable with a mandatory cloud account. Casual users setting up a simple home computer are precisely the ones locked out of the one clean, fully supported alternative that business and enterprise customers have enjoyed the entire time: power users and IT professionals. Working in corporate environments effectively face none of this friction, while ordinary consumers are stuck fighting through command prompts and disconnected network cables just to achieve the same basic outcome. This tiered treatment connects to a broader pattern worth understanding, because the local account crackdown has not happened in a vacuum. It has unfolded alongside Windows 11e's steadily increasing hardware requirements, specifically the mandatory presence of a trusted platform module, commonly known as TPM 2.0, along with secure boot support, both of which are required for a standard, fully supported installation. These requirements have effectively locked out a substantial population of otherwise perfectly capable older computers, machines that ran Windows 10 without any issues whatsoever, but that simply lack this specific security chip or have it disabled by default in their firmware. Settings. The same third-party tool, Rufus, that helps users bypass the Microsoft account requirement also happens to offer options for bypassing these hardware checks simultaneously, which tells you something revealing about how these two separate frustrations, mandatory accounts and mandatory hardware requirements, have effectively merged into a single unified workaround ecosystem in the eyes of everyday users trying to keep their existing computers functional and useful. Comparing this situation to how competing operating systems handle the exact same basic question also helps put Microsoft's specific approach into sharper perspective. Apple's macOS does require an Apple ID for full access to certain cloud-connected features like iCloud Sync and the App Store, but a Mac can still be used entirely and indefinitely as a standalone, offline machine without ever creating any account at all during the initial setup process. Linux distributions, meanwhile, have never required any centralized account of any kind, connecting to absolutely nothing beyond your own local machine unless you specifically choose to set up cloud syncing yourself. Distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and Pop! OS have become considerably more polished and genuinely user-friendly throughout 2026, and combined with compatibility layers like Steam's Proton handling an increasingly wide range of PC games, the practical barrier to fully switching away from Windows has genuinely never been lower for typical home users and even many professional workflows. And yet, despite that lower barrier, the mass exodus away from Windows that some more optimistic critics have predicted for years now simply has not materialized in any significant, measurable way. That gap between growing viable alternatives and actual user behavior might be the single most revealing part of this entire story. There is also a generational and habitual dimension to this inertia that rarely gets enough credit in these discussions. Many people have spent 20, even 30 years building an entire mental map of how a computer is supposed to work based specifically on Windows conventions, from keyboard shortcuts to file management habits to which folder certain settings live in, relearning that mental map on an entirely different platform, even one that is objectively more polished than it used to be, represents a genuine cognitive cost that goes beyond simple technical compatibility for a huge portion of the world's computer users, especially those who are not particularly tech enthusiastic to begin with. Familiarity itself becomes a kind of gravity that is remarkably difficult to escape, regardless of how many individual annoyances accumulate along the way, one update, one restriction, one closed loophole at a time. If people are this frustrated, if the backlash is this loud, this consistent, and this well documented across years of reporting, why is almost nobody actually leaving? The honest answer is more complicated and more human than a simple story about corporate overreach versus consumer resistance. Windows remains the dominant operating system on the planet for a reason that goes well beyond stubborn habit or brand loyalty. It powers the specific professional software millions of people depend on for their actual jobs, from specialized engineering tools to industry-specific applications that often have no true equivalent on other platforms. It supports an enormous decades-deep library of games, and even with tools like Steam's Proton compatibility layer making Linux gaming genuinely viable for a growing number of titles, plenty of specific games and anti-cheat systems still simply refuse to function properly outside of Windows for countless households and businesses. The practical cost of switching entirely away from Windows remains higher than the frustration of periodically fighting through an annoying setup screen once every few years when they buy a new machine. This creates a strange, almost paradoxical dynamic where deep, genuine frustration and continued, grudging loyalty exist. Simultaneously, within the exact same user base, people vent furiously on Reddit, they share workaround guides obsessively, they genuinely resent watching Microsoft close off one option after another, and then they still buy the next Windows machine anyway, because the alternative, migrating years of accumulated software, files, workflows, and muscle memory to an entirely different operating system feels like a bigger, more disruptive hassle than simply grumbling through a slightly more annoying installation process. Hundreds of millions of people are still running Windows 10 right now, well past its official end of support date, specifically because upgrading to Windows 11 feels like accepting a worse deal rather than a genuine improvement, and yet even among that frustrated, resistant group, remarkably few are actually completing a full migration to Linux or MacOS. They are simply staying put on an aging, increasingly unsupported system instead, using an extended security update program to buy themselves a bit more time before eventually being forced to make a decision they would clearly rather avoid entirely. It is also worth acknowledging that this particular controversy over local accounts does not exist in isolation. It's alongside a broader pattern of user frustration that has been building steadily throughout Windows 11's entire lifespan. The Start menu now prominently features a recommended section that frequently suggests third-party apps and services users never asked for effectively, turning a core navigation tool into a small advertising space embedded directly inside an operating system people already paid for. Windows Recall, an AI-powered feature that continuously captures and indexes screenshots of on-screen activity, faced such intense privacy criticism upon its initial announcement that Microsoft was forced to delay it, rework its security architecture, and eventually make it strictly opt-in rather than enabled by default. Even Microsoft's own leadership has publicly acknowledged, in statements throughout early 2026, that Windows 11 has fallen short of user expectations in several specific areas, and the company has since launched an internal quality-focused initiative aimed at addressing performance, reliability, and excessive AI integration throughout the operating system going forward. That broader admission matters here because it suggests Microsoft itself recognizes that trust has genuinely eroded among a meaningful portion of its user base. Yet even as the company promises renewed focus on core stability and reliability moving into 2027, there has been no indication whatsoever that the underlying philosophy around mandatory online accounts is going to reverse course anytime soon. If anything, every single update over the past year has pushed further in the opposite direction, closing loopholes rather than reopening them and reinforcing the idea that Windows is increasingly being designed as a connected service platform rather than a standalone, locally controlled personal tool the way it functioned for most of its multi-decade history. So what does this all actually add up to? A genuinely important piece of user control and privacy has been steadily, deliberately dismantled over the course of roughly 4 years, one small technical update at a time, each individual change modest enough on its own to avoid becoming a single unified controversy, but collectively adding up to a fundamentally different relationship between a person and the computer sitting right in front of them. The backlash has been real, loud, and well documented across countless forums, articles, and Reddit threads, and still almost nobody is actually switching back, not because people have stopped caring, but because the practical alternatives remain just inconvenient enough, and the sunk cost of staying just comfortable enough, that grumbling quietly through yet another forced sign-in screen continues to win out over the much larger disruption of walking away entirely. Perhaps the most fitting way to summarize this entire situation is that Microsoft appears to have correctly calculated something uncomfortable about its own user base. Loud, sustained, well-documented frustration does not automatically translate into lost customers, at least not on any timeline that meaningfully affects quarterly earnings or long-term platform strategy, as long as the professional software, the gaming library, and decades of accumulated muscle memory keep people tethered to Windows. The company appears willing to absorb wave after wave of public criticism over choices like this one, betting correctly, at least so far, that annoyance alone rarely translates into an actual mass migration away from the platform that still runs the vast majority of the world's personal computers. If this kind of honest look at how major tech companies quietly reshape the tools you use every single day is exactly the content you want more of, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because we will keep tracking these changes as Microsoft and every other major platform continue reshaping what user choice actually means going forward.